Joining us, Angelo. Earlier, my colleague Diabo Sito was speaking to a professor, and they were talking about Ekurhuleni. And one of the things she noted was that Ekurhuleni was downgraded by one of the ratings agencies. But interestingly enough, it was also given a clean bill of audit health by the Auditor General. That's rather interesting. And also, if I could ask my colleagues to bring up the Ekurhuleni graphic so that we can discuss the numbers that are coming out thus far. Your thoughts there?
So I think Andre Divanacher outlined the challenges that Ekurhuleni is facing, but I think what we need to weigh up is, on the one hand, you have a domestic sort of situation where you have the Auditor General looking at the way in which municipal accounts are run and how the accountability process works. Then you have a separate ratings agency which is not accountable to the South African political sphere. In fact, it works quite independently inside this global capitalist formation and has very little accountability for its decisions and processes and the consequence thereof. And it is looking at investment opportunities and the ability of these metropolitan institutions or of these civic institutions to meet the demands of the capitalist system. And so we need to weigh into our analysis of that these are two very different kinds of institutions looking at very different kinds of things. The second issue that I think we need to bear in mind is that we have a changing and rather fast-changing global economy. And so the kinds of industries and the kinds of businesses that were sort of centered around what used to be called the Erythropolis of Ekurhuleni will have been impacted very negatively by the COVID lockdown, the global pandemic, its consequences for the global industry. And so it may be important for the governors of that particular metropolitan area, once the results come in, the seats have been assigned, to begin to think how in future they're going to address the challenge of local economic development and reintegration or integration, because they weren't ever together before, of these socially disparate areas. This is one of the spaces which have massive informal settlements, underserviced traditional old South African townships, and industrial areas that have to be dealt with in terms of, among other things, the Capitalocene and the Anthropocene, which is the failure of this species to address the climate change catastrophe that's unfolding around us.
Let's take a look at the screen there, Angelo, and look at the race for votes in Ekurhuleni. I hope you've got powerful eyes. But basically we see that the ANC is in the lead at 34%. The DA is at 33%. The EFF at 12%. Action SA at 6%. And others at, okay, all right. And then we have others who are lagging behind at 13%. Your sense of what's happening there at the moment?
So I think it's inevitable that there will be some kind of coalition government, because nobody seems to be approaching the 50% mark to form a majority government. And how those coalitions will be formed is crucial. So I've said repeatedly that coalitions of spite is what we had in 2016, where parties decided to do these deals to keep somebody else out of power. And I think this time round the deals have to be made to keep governance on track, to return governance to areas where they haven't been before, focus on services, focus on the citizens' needs and requirements, and work together in ways that, one, speak to the core principles of the party that leads the coalition, and the smaller parties negotiating very carefully what it is they want out of this coalition in advance, and not have the situation of collapsing councils that we saw in the wake of those 2016 elections, because spite only takes you so far.
Yeah.
Keeping somebody out of power is not enough to maintain a very complex, not only recovery, but actual building process for a municipality.
Yeah, but one could argue that Ekurhuleni has done a little bit better than the other metros, you know, like Tshwane and Nelson Mandela Bay. The ANC, of course, heading it up, but has obviously had to work with other parties in order to run the metro.
Right, so if you win a narrow majority or you win a near majority, it's easier to form a coalition with a small group. But if we're looking at two big parties sitting in the 30s, either of them could end up taking the metro if they form a coalition with the right kinds of people. And despite politicians prior to the election saying, I will not form a coalition with so-and-so, I think in the end, power is a powerful magnet for politicians. Control over the resources, however meager, however struggling, however difficult it is to get those rates paid, to get those services paid for, to get the revenue in. People like those because they have patronage networks inside all the parties of people who depend on access to control over the resources and the levers of power that allows that access to resources in order to run that municipality. So that, I think, is going to be a crucial test for Ekurhuleni. And then the next test for the governors will be, how do they adjust the economy of a metro that used to be inside one particular vision of the economy, in a global economy that's shifting away from the airlines industry, that is going to be beset by pandemic issues for the rest of the century, and the climate catastrophe, which will affect the ways in which the industries around, for example, freight and cargo, those industries have to be shifted in the next 10 to 15 years.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you say that, because of course right now we've got global nations looking at, climate change, adaptation, mitigation at COP17 in Glasgow, which we're not really focusing on because, we're looking at the elections, but valid points there. And then of course there's been a lot of discussion around small parties being kingmakers. That looks a certain deal that they are going to be kingmakers.
Absolutely, and it's the astuteness of these smaller parties to figure out what it is they want to do, what they've promised their supporters, to go into these meetings with the larger parties and have in-principled agreements on what it is they're going to get out of it. And the same goes for potential independents. When they go into these councils, they'll have to negotiate with the parties who have, caucuses in these councils to say, I will support these kinds of measures if you give me these kinds of returns. And we didn't really have that in 2016. What we had in 2016 was, we need to keep so-and-so out of power, so let's form a coalition of convenience. And that works in the short term, but after, it's a bit like these reality shows where married on first sight. It doesn't really work out in the end, because what has to happen is a very complex political, economic environment has to be managed and improved. And that includes contemporary challenges, unemployment, lack of economic development opportunities, lack of social and spatial reintegration and integration, services that have been let go, infrastructure that has to be developed and addressed. And then the longer term challenges, which is increasingly a younger population that will have to deal with the challenges of managing cities in 2030 and 2040, which should be local government election issues. Those are not national and supranational issues. Those are local issues.
Yeah.
Because if they build a coal power station in your backyard, you're contributing to the very problem that will result in the crises that people are facing. There'll be food insecurity, migration challenges. Those all should be local government issues, not just national.
Angelo, let's just halt it there for now. Let's cross now